Well, welcome to Ames Public Library for tonight's virtual event with Nicolás Medina Mora, author of América del Norte. I'm Megan, the Adult Services Manager here at Ames Public Library. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Iowa Center for the Book at Ames Public Library and is made possible by the support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies. The Center for the Book is the Library of Congress, is a community of 56 affiliated centers promoting reading, libraries, and literacy throughout their work across the country. These centers elevate and advocate for their state's unique literary heritage through works that reflect distinctly American experiences. Every year, each center names two books, one for youth and one for adults, to the Great Reads from Great Places program. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome the author of our adult selection, América del Norte. I just have some brief housekeeping to go over. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to Ames Public Library's YouTube channel after the program ends. If you have any questions for our author, please post them in the Q&A. And if you get bumped out of tonight's event, please follow the original link to get right back to us. At this point, I would like to welcome Dr. Lucia Suarez, Associate Professor in the Department of World Language and Cultures at Iowa State University, who will be facilitating tonight's event.
Thank you. So thank you, APL, for organizing this. Thank you, Nicolás, for being here. And thank you for everybody that's watching this, because this is I think, a wonderful book to be reading with a lot of subjects to be thinking through. So first and foremost, let me introduce Nicolás Medina Mora, who's the author of our book, Club Read, América del Norte. He identifies as a Mexican writer. Born and raised in Mexico City, he moved to the United States to attend college. He wound up staying for 10 years, during which time he worked as a reporter in New York City and earned an MFA in creative writing from the University of Iowa's Nonfiction Writing program. The thesis he wrote for that degree became the seed of this first novel, América del Norte, published in English first last year and forthcoming in Spanish translation. After returning to his home country in 2018, he spent several years working as an editor at Revista Nexos, a culture and politics monthly published in Mexico City. He now works as a screenwriter, teaches literature at the Escuela Superior de Cine, and writes for a number of publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and Plus One, and The Baffler. All you have to do is get online and look at how incredibly productive Nicolás is to see that this book, and it's a nice thick book, but a very, very easy and kind of enticing read, is only a little bit of his larger production. So welcome, Nicolás.
Thank you so much, Lucia. And thank you very much for the Center for the Book for this great honor. I am thrilled to be here with you tonight. So this is a novel that is difficult to read from in front of an audience because it's very fragmentary and it has a number of different plots that fit together in complicated ways that don't lend themselves to like short excerpts. But seeing that that this is an event about the state of Iowa, I'm going to focus on one of the threads of the book, which is concerned with the narrator, who's this guy, Sebastián Arteaga Salazar, who is, the heir of a wealthy Mexican family who has moved to the United States and hopes to stay there for good. And is at present a student at the University of Iowa and gradually begins to discover that this might not be possible, staying in the States, I mean. I'm going to skip around. There's a bunch of stuff in between the different sections that I'm going to read. So if it doesn't make if it doesn't quite make sense, don't worry. The book itself invites that kind of reaction. So you're not missing out on anything. Okay, so Para Cosme del Rosario Bell. After spending the winter break in Mexico City on my own, Lee, my girlfriend, had gone home to her parents in California. I returned to Iowa, where the snow was at its peak and the cold air vibrated with uncertainty. Over the previous months, the Trump administration had formed a task force to identify naturalized citizens eligible for deportation, announced it would no longer allow foreigners who enrolled in Medicaid to become permanent residents, and repeatedly refused to issue passports to citizens of perceived Hispanic descent. It had also begun to imprison children in concentration camps, though that last news item was so intense that it was easier to pretend the concentration camps were not concentration camps and the children were not children. I had nothing to hide, but had I made sure I met the criteria to file my taxes as a non-resident alien? Did I check that the lady from the Office of International Students and Scholars remembered to initial the document that authorized me to teach 2 different courses instead of just 2 sections of the same class? And what about that time in New York when I dragged poor Carlos to the god-awful party in the UP wastelands of Greenpoint, where, unsatisfied with getting to cocaine-fueled shouting match about whether it was racist to apply North American racial categories to people from the Dominican Republic, I proceeded to let the host borrow my phone to request a re-up from his dealer, a moonlighted bike messenger who called himself the cheesemonger, and who months later found himself in the crosshairs of the district attorney for Kings County, who proceeded to drop suppressing substantial charges on him, and then use his testimony to secure indictments against a number of people associated with the call history of his cell phone, including a corporate lawyer, an art dealer, a burned-out rock star, miscellaneous finance bros, a college kid, and a coterie of early heiresses from the Upper East Side. The idea being to combat the unfounded accusations heard in so-called activist circles and in certain corners of the yellow press that the hardworking prosecutors of the proud borough of Brooklyn focused a disproportionate amount of their not inconsiderable investigative resources on criminal cases against poor people of color. And sure, it had been years, and none of the Greenpoint yuppies were ever arrested, and there was no reason to think that even a rookie prosecutor would be foolish enough to build a case off a single text message, especially considering that the famous monger, that indolent, unprofessional motherfucker, hadn't even bothered to reply, much less deliver the package in question. But who was to say that the public relations people on J Street wouldn't at some point conclude that the only surefire way to improve the DA's dismal approval ratings among key demographics of the electorate was to please both the white xenophobes of Borough Park and the Latino socialists of Sunset Park by hanging a foreigner with decadent taste and a fancy degree and a polysyllabic last name out to dry? That my fears were ridiculous didn't make them any less terrifying. The Trump administration's immigration policies changed by the day. What was once allowed became illegal without warning. Each morning brought a new leaked memo from the Department of Homeland Security proposing additional rules and regulations, confusing changes to the definition of unlawful presence and duration of stay, new penalties for minor infractions that could result in deportation and a 10-year ban from entering the United States. My foreign anxiety, as I came to call it, was an infinitely complex and mortifying version of the irrational suspicion that assaulted me once a month as I crossed the Pentagress on my way to class. I'd become convinced that I had left the Bialetti on the stove, and that the stove was on, and that it was only a matter of time before the pressure in the pot hit critical, transforming the charming espresso maker into an IED. I would run back into the apartment, ready to find it covered in shrapnel and coffee grounds, only to discover the pot in the sink. El abogado del diablo. The breaking point arrived in February when I discovered that the Trump administration was considering a new rule that would require companies wishing to hire specialized non-resident aliens, the category of foreigners who qualified for the visa I had in New York, demonstrated they had made a good faith effort to put America first by only hiring immigrants if they were willing to pay them a minimum salary that far exceeded the going rate for someone with my experience in my field. Besides, I'd still had 3 semesters left in the nonfiction writing program, plenty of time for Trump to decide that optional practical training, the year-long work permit issued to foreign graduates of US universities, and a traditional springboard to a more permanent immigration status, was the only thing standing between good American citizens and good American jobs, or else that the very notion of a good work visa was an unpatriotic affront to the American worker. Time was running out. Each passing month under the nativist administration meant staying in the country was more difficult. I had to act soon and decisively. And so I wrote to a number of wealthy foreigners I knew from college, asking if they could recommend an immigration lawyer who might be able to help me with an application for permanent residency. Money wasn't an issue, I'd be sure to tell them. This wasn't the time for privileged scruples. The life I had built over the previous 9 years was under threat. I was ready to leverage all advantages available to me, no matter how unsavory. I told myself that the end justified the means, that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable or untoward, just certainty that I wouldn't have to leave the country that most of the people I loved call home. That same afternoon, I spoke on the phone with a fellow Yale alumnus, a former English major with a Beacon Hill accent who ran an immigration law firm that catered to hedge funds, but who occasionally took on writer clients to feel less like a sellout. He asked me a few questions about the 3 short years that constituted what he called my journalistic career, and concluded I was a strong candidate for a program that allowed aliens of extraordinary ability to sponsor themselves for permanent residency. He then quoted his fee and offered me a discount on account of my artistic profession. Thank you so much, I said, even though the discounted rate was still in the 5 figures. I feel better already. Yeah, man, I get it, he said. These are dark times. The good news is that you are the kind of immigrant they want, highly educated, highly skilled, and with a demonstrated history of employment and no criminal record. You should see some of my pro bono clients, though. They're desperate, and unfortunately with good reason. El Cinturón del Occidente. I stood in line to pick up my rental car, stomping my feet against the cold. It was 5 a.m. in late March, and while the snow was starting to melt, the hours before dawn were still bone rattling. For once, though, I was happy to put up with the wind chill. The Commission from the National Republic had felt like the first cigarette after a failed attempt to quit. Still, getting authorization to get paid to do reporting while on a student visa had proven so stressful that I doubted I would ever do it again. After I got the keys to a beaten down Subaru, I went through my plan of attack and reviewed the notes from the interviews I had already conducted. The assignment was simple: profile the leader of the local nurses union, who was running in the Democratic primary for governor. I think nurses are so cool, I had said a couple of weeks earlier to her communications manager, a rather cute girl with a short hair, Teamsters bomber jacket, and the very career-appropriate name, Alex Press, as we smoked cigarettes outside the candidate's trailer. My mom has cancer, so I've gotten to watch them do miracles. Alex took a long drag and shook her head as she exhaled from her nose. Cancer? And you're sucking on death sticks? What the fuck is wrong with you, man? I stopped at the Come and Go, I would never get over the name, for a half-gallon of iced coffee, washed down the absurd dose of instant-release amphetamines that some sleep-deprived resident at the university hospital had prescribed me just to get me to go away, and drove out of town. The campaign stop I was covering was the annual spring parade celebrated in Merlo, a town of some 20,000 people, an hour and a half from the Foz City. That's Iowa City. The place had been prosperous in the mid-century, but had gone into decline in the 70s when the coal ran out and the meat packers moved. The country, which had been a Union town, a Democratic stronghold, drifted to the right. In 2016, almost 70% of its residents voted for Donald Trump. I headed south on US 218. The sun rose to my left, illuminating the landscape, but there was nothing to see. There were no cities, no mountains or rivers, not even trees. Only the rectilinear highway and an endless expanse of yellowing emptiness, thawing land that had once been a prairie of long grass and bison, which had been so denatured with the fertilizers and pesticides required to maximize the yield of genetically modified seeds that it was now best described as a biotechnological factory. I found myself thinking of a story Charlie had told me months earlier. A group of fiction students were driving to Chicago. One of them needed to pee, but they were on the stretch of I-80 where there are no rest stops, so they pulled over in the middle of a cornfield. While the boy went off to piss, a girl got out of the car to stretch her legs. She walked to the edge of the field, tore out a cob, bit into it like it was fruit rather than biomass, and shattered her front teeth. By the time I got to Merlo, the sun was high in the sky. It was a brisk day without clouds, the air already electric with spring. I wandered down a wide avenue lined with handsome gray stone buildings, a hotel, a theater, a bank, which conjured images of a capital in miniature. A small, proud city of prosperous burghers, unionized hawk butchers, and Lutheran farmers come to market in their Sunday best. The scene before my eyes, however, didn't match the architecture. The din of exchange was absent, the storefronts locked and the locks rusted, the streets full of sunlight, yet emptying people, as in a painting by Giorgio de Chirico. But then as I approached an intersection, I held a joyful racket of accordion brasses there. I turned the corner and found myself before a Technicolor cornucopia, crates of ripe red tomatoes and wet fresh cilantro, night green jalapenos and noon yellow habaneros, sun-soft mangoes and avocados, pyramids of onions, cigarettes of limes, plums, prunes, papayas and picayas, strips of candy made of tamarind, marzipan and amaranth, garlands of garlic, hoja santa, nepazote, piloncillo and achiote, hierbabuena, verbena, jamaica, anís and canela, bundles of chile costeño, chipotle, mulato, pasilla, guajillo, and long, narrow ribbons of lottery tickets, fluttering in the breeze, vibrant like Tibetan prayer flags. I walked into the store hoping to talk to one of the Latinx voters the candidate I was profiling was desperate to attract. The door closed behind me, ringing a little bell that called the attention of the middle-aged brown man sweeping the floor. He looked up, raised his Chicago Cubs hat, and smiled a bit too widely. "Can I help you find anything?" he said in unaccented English. "I'm afraid I'm not a customer." The man's smile faded. Sir, if you're from Homeland Security, no, señor, ¿cómo cree? He twisted his head and narrowed his eyes, less with suspicion than with bewilderment. ¿Así de güerito? ¿Dónde aprendiste a hablar como chilango? Pues, ¿dónde más? En Chilangolandia, el defectuoso, en la gran Tenochtitlán. The man burst out laughing, though I got the sense he was amused by the situation rather than by my jokes. Mira nomás, ¿qué anda haciendo un güerito chilango en este pinche pueblo jodido, en este pinche estado fregado, en este pinche país olvidado de Dios? He told me that his name was Edwin Mendoza and that he had come to Iowa from Puebla 30 years ago. He hadn't heard of the candidate. The campaign had yet reached out to his people. This negligence struck him as a mistake because he wasn't a citizen and thus couldn't vote, but that wasn't true of many Mexican folks in the area. There were more of them now than there used to be, and some white people in Merlo weren't happy about it, even before Trump. But after the election, things had gotten ugly. Every week he heard someone he knew had been detained or deported. Me trae malos recuerdos, he said. ¿Recuerdos de qué? De cuando se llevaron a medio Marshalltown. He then described the morning in December 2006 when dozens of ICE agents stormed into the town's pork processing plant. The rumors, the panic, the people hiding in cornfields and basements. How he had driven to the plant to find out what was happening. How he had seen agents in anoraks and sunglasses load more than 100 of his neighbors, still drenched in pig blood, into buses waiting to take them to a place from which nobody came back. That's why I moved here, Mendoza went on. The town was haunted, but now it's started again, and it's worse than ever. Folks are afraid to go to school, to church, to take their kids to work. It's bad for my business, because people worry about going to a store that sells Mexican products. Any Mexican place, really. It's no way to live. I would go back to Puebla, but you change so much living here that when you return, your people don't recognize you. So if your magazine can get a message to the people in charge, I'd ask that you tell them to please stop the raids. I chatted with him for a bit longer. They walked out of the store and found the street transformed. Hundreds of people had gathered along the avenue, standing with arms crossed or sitting on folding chairs, grabbing beers from coolers. The sound of a marching band drifted in from behind the corner, and all at once the crowd was cheering and throwing confetti for an American procession. The 6-year-old Queen of Spring with her crown of flowers and her creepy makeup, the high school drumline in their circus uniforms, the balding mayor in a borrowed convertible, the firefighters on their giant toy trucks, the cops on their Iraq War Humvees, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Friends of the Iowa Prairie, the Rotaries, the Oddfellows, the Historical Preservation Society, the Girl Scouts, the Future Farmers of America, the UAW workers and their luncheon candidate, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, 3 Lutheran denominations, 2 evangelical churches, the owners and employers of the regional bank, the dry cleaner, the auto parts store, the landscaping firm, the steakhouse, the diner, the burger joint, the red sauce joint, the movie theater, the funeral home, the dive bar, the gun range, and not a single business, association, or institution that could have been mistaken for Mexican. How are we doing on time? Okay, well, I want to do something that is a bit impolite, which is to read to you from the very end of the book, but it seems appropriate, right? The only thing you need to know is that our protagonist has been detained at the San Francisco International Airport and that his American girlfriend is waiting for him on the other side. Levántate y anda. And then the law called me by my name. Salazar, Arteaga Salazar. Blood ran through my arteries. My ears rang. My rage evaporated, and in its place arose an ugly combination of hope and fear. My body lifted itself from the chair. The world sharpened as if I had new glasses. I took a step, then another, taking care to avoid the eyes of the other foreigners. What would I be willing to do for a green card? For citizenship? In that moment, I realized, I was willing to do a great deal of betraying. I was surprised by how brittle I had proven. After an hour in a windowless room, I was all but ready to sell out my neighbors. Air coursed through my trachea. The diaphragm rose and fell. The story now seemed simple. I had remade myself in the image of the rulers of the empire, hoping that if I came to resemble them closely enough, they would welcome me as one of their own. With the years, I came to believe my own charade and convinced myself I had more in common with white Americans than with most Mexicans. As it turned out, I had fooled nobody but myself. not the Mexicans, not the white Americans, and certainly not the US government. There was no denying it anymore. I loved America more than myself, but America did not love me back. And yet there I was, walking up to the inspection desk in the secondary screening room at the San Francisco International Airport, hoping that America would change his mind. I apologize for the wait, the officer said. That is quite all right, I mumbled, feeling my accent grow thick and my diction clumsy. She smiled but didn't look up from her computer. She had light brown skin and Mexican features. She kept her long black hair in an intricate braid. She wore a dark red lipstick that contrasted with the navy blue of her uniform. She must have been around my age. She was very beautiful. Is this your first visit seeking admission to the United States on your student visa? No, I've had it for 2 years. I did consular processing at the embassy in Mexico City. She took my passport from the red folder and flipped it through the pages. The desk was unusually high, reaching almost to my chin, and she sat on a tall stool, such that I saw her from below. She didn't seem angry or impatient, but instead emanated a calm confidence in her own authority, a sense that she was as comfortable in her own skin as she was in her uniform. I wondered whether she had risen through the ranks quickly, whether her austere but dignified politeness originated in the knowledge that her supervisors saw her as a rising star. I picture her a few years younger, recently graduated from college, living with her parents in one of the vanishing Mexican neighborhoods of San Francisco, trying to choose between taking out a loan to go to law school or applying to the federal law enforcement training centers. What had she told herself when she made her choice? What had she told her parents and her grandparents? How many generations did a Mexican family need to live in America before a daughter's decision to become an immigration officer no longer raised eyebrows? Or had her family been in California before the annexation, before independence, before the conquest? Did she lack other options? Did she hope to change things from the inside? Or did she truly believe she was working to secure her homeland? So the last time you were admitted was late last year, right? She said. Yes. What happened was I got confused earlier with your colleague. She asked me and I tried to remember, but I didn't remember the date. But I remember that I come for a New Year's Eve party, and that makes sense. She took a stamp from the desk, pressed it onto my passport, and handed my documents to me. Then she looked me in the eye and said, "Welcome to the United States." It goes on, but maybe we can stop for now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I am going to start my questions after reading something, because
Sure.
my question is about genre and process.
Sure.
Of course, right?
Of course.
Someone who writes about literature. So I'm going to read something that's yours. So you said at the end, a note on facts.
Right.
It says, América del Norte is not a memoir or a work of journalism or scholarship, but a fiction in the strong sense of the term. It does not purport to represent reality. The characters who populate it are not depictions of real people, but allegorical figures who embody abstract concepts. Had I lived in an age more suited to my temperament, I would have named them after the fashion of Baroque morality plays. The Creole, the American, irony, folly, fate, and faith. Any attempt to identify non-fictional equivalents that do not have is a gross misreading that runs contrary to my authorial intentions. By the same token, though, this novel contends with history and current events, as we see that you've just read. It treats them as material for the imagination, not as an object of study. It is full of inaccuracies, most of them intentional. Readers interested in factual accounts of the historical and political issues discussed in this book are encouraged to consult the following bibliography. And you give us this wonderful bibliography, and I recognize probably some of your teachers from Yale, Echeverria, Helena Adorno, all people that we've all read, that we've all, studied and love, right? That have informed your really, really, I think, beautiful literary and, you say, fictitious takes on the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that when somebody insists so intensely on how fictitious something is, that of course I'm going to sit there, and I don't light a cigarette, but I'm going to sit there and say, really?
Mm-hmm.
And so my first question is about genre and process. So it seems that you started at Iowa's Writers Workshop, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is, I read about you and I did some sleuthing, right? To write a memoir. So it seems to me that the information I got is that you wanted to start, or you started with a memoir, but ended up writing a novel. And so I want you, or if you could, explain how you define memoir, because this comes back to this ending point where you're telling me it's fiction. It's really fiction.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of like, So could you explain how you define memoir and
Sure.
how it is that you ended up segueing into what I would call, if I were, if I were writing about this, I would say that it was an autobiographical fiction. But then that's my field. I see autobiography in a lot of our literature, right? And so that, may just be my lens. But if you could talk to us about this, I would love that.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is a great question, and also one of my favorite questions to think about, genre and the nature of fiction and nonfiction. Um, I think like the easiest way to explain it is that I went to the part of the Iowa writing community that I belong to, the nonfiction writing program, has this long tradition of basically beginning from the assumption that essays can include fiction
Mhm.
or can do violence to the facts, right? This is due mostly to the work of my thesis advisor and a writer who I admire immensely, this guy, John Degara, who has made that case across his work and gotten a bunch of flack for it, right? And when I showed up at Iowa, I had been a reporter for the entirety of my professional career, such as it existed at the time. Um, and I was at the same time attracted to and put off by this idea that you could lie in your essays. And so the way that I was able to reconcile, on the one hand, my scruples as a reporter, and on the other hand, my desire to avail myself of the freedom that the nonfiction program insisted was afforded to essayists, was by uh, going for a novel, right? The novel being this amorphous form that can contain pretty much whatever you put in it. It can contain long essayistic digressions, right? There's a point in War and Peace where Tolstoy pulls a handbrake and, says like, and now we shall discuss the nature of history for the next 20 pages. All right. So he's lying under a tree. Let's go on, carry on, right? Um, and so that attracted me because I wanted to be able to lie with impunity, right? I wanted to be able to make the characters who are quite obviously, not the people they're obviously not people who belong to my real life, but who somebody could mistake them for them. Hence the need for this disclaimer. I wanted to have the freedom to be able to make them what I needed to make them for my narrative to work, as opposed to having to change my narrative to fit the facts. Um, the note that you read at the end of the book is an attempt to sort of like come clean in that regard, and it's also something that I did on the advice of my lawyer. Right, but I would be a very bad student of González Echevarría and Roland Adorno and that crew if I actually thought that writers' authorial intentions matter at all. Right, I think that people are free to make of this book whatever they will, because I seriously think that all authors, the moment they become authors, are dead. Right. But at the same time, it was important to me, not just for legal reasons, but also ethically, to be able to give anybody who might be mistaken for a character in this novel the opportunity to say that it wasn't true. Just because a lot of the portraits of these fictional characters who may be mistaken for real people aren't always very flattering. Does that make sense?
Right. So so if I were going to be the devil's advocate, I would say you're covering your tracks
Yeah,
in the
absolutely.
process of divulging, right?
Well, what I would say to the devil's advocate is that you can also cover your tracks by insisting that the stuff you're writing is entirely non-fictional, right? That's what Jose Vasconcelos, who's this towering 20th century Mexico City Mexican intellectual who did amazing things and also was an awful person and wound up embracing really terrible ideas. He published this like incredible, unreadable masterpiece of autobiography called The Creole Ulysses, which is one of the main influences on my novel. And he insisted to the end of his life that all of what he had written was true. even though it wasn't, right? So I would say that memoirists are just as are covering their tracks just as much as writers of autofiction. They're just going about it in a different way. I don't know. I mean, like I think that both paths have their benefits and their downsides, right? But the one that I picked was fiction, and I'm happy that I did, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not asking you to defend your choice,
No.
but for the readers, the people who want to know more about your text, and because there are moments that sound so incredibly autobiographical, right? People who are reading this text and who don't who don't know you or who don't know, it just sounds like there's so much of it that must be autobiographical, which undoubtedly for all of our writing, there's something that's us always put in there, right? But I just wanted you to share with this audience, your process and the whole play with genre, right? But now that you mentioned Vasconcelos, he's my question 4 here, but let me jump to that a little bit. I teach Vasconcelos, La Raza Cósmica, in my class. And I really love the way that you made him come alive by referring to his life and other writings. And you just said, that, you really, and you do, you bring in his autobiography. And I would love it if you spoke more about the role Vasconcelos plays in your life, as well as, and you just actually told us, that, it's based on that. But if you could, does Vasconcelos play a role in your life, in your education? Because Vasconcelos was an educator, right?
Yes.
And in your literary work and development, because he's a major Mexican political and literary figure, regardless of, and you have a section where you talk about Pound and, Pound's literature and how can this, so you're playing with this concept of who is the writer and the values of the writer, and what is the merit of the product of this writer. And then, framing it largely in historical terms, right? The historical terms of how do we read this? What do we take? What do we not take? How does it influence us? So going back to Vasconcelos in your life, I was, I don't know if our audience knows Vasconcelos' work. If you could talk a little bit about when you first read him, how you knew him, how it affected you, why you pull this. Vasconcelos is one of, you have Cortés, Vasconcelos. You have these major kind of like historical figures kind of creating this arch in this novela, right? And if you could talk a little bit about that, I think it would be great help for your audience.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So, okay, José Vasconcelos. The easiest way to describe him is, and this is obviously doing him violence, but he basically invented what we think of when the word Mexico comes to mind today, right? The fact that like what Americans know as the Mexican hat dance is like the national dance is because he picked it. When people think of Diego Rivera's murals, right, which are, on the cover of basically every book on Mexican history or textbook on Mexican history produced in the last many decades, well, Vasconcelos was the guy who commissioned Diego Rivera to paint these murals. He was the Minister of Education right after the Mexican Revolution, and he took the country from 80% illiteracy to 80% literacy over the course of a few years. He was also a philosopher. He wrote a number of very complicated and, mixed bag in terms of their quality books on metaphysics, the philosophy of history, aesthetics. And he also was a political theorist whose best known work is the one that Lucia was telling us that she teaches at her classes, The Cosmic Race, like La Raza Cósmica. If you're generous, that book is an argument for why miscegenation, race mixing is a force for good rather than for evil. And it's an argument for that prophesizes Latin America becoming preeminent in the world because of its race mixture, in opposition to the United States with its insistence on segregation and its, the legacy of chattel slavery is still haunting it. Vasconcelos also was eventually, later in his life, a Nazi. This is something that I think is very important to say whenever we talk about him. He became a supporter of the Third Reich. He edited a magazine that published Nazi propaganda. In Mexico, people tend to kind of like gloss over that fact. And so, for instance, I recently went to a hearing at the Mexican Congress because they were considering using a new facsimilar edition of the literature for young people anthology that Vasconcelos produced as Minister of Education as a textbook. And I had written the introduction to the facsimile, and so they asked me to come talk, and I said, like, well, of course, this is a wonderful book, and you should of course use it if you think it's best, but this guy's a Nazi, right? He's like Ezra Pound, who was a fascist, the great American poet, or like Martin Heidegger, the most important German philosopher of the 20th century, who was also a Nazi. And the role that he plays in the book, I guess, is the protagonist, Sebastián, has this dilemma, which is that he is obviously white, at least he thinks so, and he certainly is white in Mexico, but in the United States, he finds himself, thrown into the same category as people who are much more marginalized than he is. And then gradually, as the novel progresses and the first administration of Donald Trump progresses, he gradually begins to realize that he too will be marginalized in his adopted country, in the US, because he is lumped in the same category as these racialized Mexicans that he doesn't see himself as a part of, right? And Vasconcelos was somebody who thought about this very, very intensely, partially because he went to school in the United States. He did his elementary studies in Eagle Pass, Texas. He spoke perfect English. He spent many years of exile at various times in the United States. And the word that he sort of rescues from the depths of Mexican history to describe this tension is criollo, which doesn't mean the same thing as it does in Haiti. It means somebody who is a descendant of Spaniards, but is born in the Americas. And so Sebastián, the protagonist, and I guess me, the author, both see themselves as criollos. And the paradox of the criollo, which is you are on the one hand the most privileged person in your country, and on the other hand you remain a colonial subject because you had the misfortune of being born in the colonies, right, in the metropole. That is in some ways the central conflict of the novel, the central problem that he faces. But yeah, Vasconcelos, worth reading and fascinating and also scary. Be scared.
Can you talk a little bit more about how he's scary?
He's scary because he's convincing, At least I find him convincing. Not in his Nazi era. I think that by that point, it's very easy to kind of like see that he's, not somebody that you should take seriously as a model to follow. But in the Cosmic Race, even though there's passages where he says really, really awful things and things that are, without doubt, very violent and very damaging to a lot of people, his vision of Latin America becoming preeminent and of the era of white supremacy, as he calls it, coming to an end by means of like a cross-cultural, interracial, like fraternizing, or he thinks of it in very kind of like erotic terms, right?
Miscegenation.
Yeah. He thinks that very much like Nietzsche, who unlike what people seem to think about him, he advocated for racial mixture as like the only way out for Europe. One reads The Cosmic Race, and one, especially when I read it, for the first time when I was living in the States, because even though he shaped my education, people don't really read him in Mexico very much. I remember thinking, yes, of course, my white American partner, and I, like, our love will redeem this continent. And of course, that's not the case, right? I think that I don't actually think that racial mixture will fix anything, because I think that thinking in terms of races is like as anything or the diagnosis of like the ills of a country, right? Because racism certainly exists, but races as such don't. I think that that's a mistake, and it's one that the step from like thinking that racial mixing is the answer to anything. It's a very short step to thinking that one race is supreme over the others, or or superior to others. And so I don't know. I mean, I think that Vasconcelos is, I don't know. I mean, I love reading him. I respect him immensely, and I hope that the Mexican government doesn't use his anthology to, teach literacy to young children, because I wouldn't want his ideas to become, the common currency again. I think that would be bad, but I'm tortured about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, because there's a trajectory, again, like in your novel, there's a trajectory, right? There's a trajectory of questioning, there's a trajectory of experience, there's a trajectory of trying to figure out ways in which to fix what has not worked historically. And race historically is an easy concept, but it almost ignores other things like class
Yes.
and it's much more complicated. So I wouldn't. I mean, when I first read it, La Raza Cósmica, it was for me, my first interpretation was about honoring mestizaje. And from my perspective at that time, I guess 30 years ago, I guess maybe 20, um, it was refreshing. It was a refreshing counter to racial segregation,
Yes.
to these issues of racial purity, which later we read in Vasconcelos actually leads to this whole, it goes back to the Spanish crown and blanqueamiento. So you
Yes.
can have this mixture, but the mixture is with the goal of whitening, right?
That's right.
So there's that distinction that in Latin America, there's the hope for whitening, regardless how much of a mix you are. And in the United States, you are always black, regardless of how incredibly white with that one drop rule. So there's this tension between North and South America or Latin America and North America with respect to race, right? But as you are saying about your own writing, right? It afflicts you, right? Because it's the personal, right? The personal versus this larger historical miasma of conflict, of categorical conflicts, right?
Yeah.
So here that takes me to my next question is history sometimes cannot be proven, so there is fiction, different versions of a story. You play with what you write in historical sections about, especially about Montezuma and Cortés. Can you talk about how you wrote, edited those sections, how they changed as you discussed this novel with your editor and other readers? So I keep going back, I mean, because I think that I keep going back to genre and process, right? Because I don't have answers. I have observations always. And the more I read and the more I see history with a capital H, and and then all the little histories, um the more I think of, and I do, I mean, it's funny because you said once you've written a novel that the author is dead, and I'm not of that affiliation. I know that the French would always say l'auteur est mort. Yeah, but I never feel that. I actually think that the author comes more alive in the process of writing. I mean, Vasconcelos, after his death, how many years, he's still being discussed by us precisely because of his production, of his authorial angst that you also express in your own writing and now in this introduction, right? So if you could talk to me again, going back to genre, fiction, and process, I would love to hear
Sure.
that.
No, I mean, there's parallel to tension between fiction and nonfiction, which are literary genres. There's a tension between fiction and history, which is, an academic discipline, and also, I suppose, ostensibly a kind of nonfiction. Um, Vasconcelos is an interesting entry point to this because his autobiography, which is very long, it's 4 volumes. There's two competing editions of it. There's the original editions, and then there's the ones that he, said were definitive editions that were published toward the end of his life that excise all of the passages where he talks about his adulterous affairs or, his rather sinful conduct over the course of his life, because he had once again become a fervent Catholic and he wanted to he didn't want posterity to remember him as a sinner, even though actually he's much more compelling as a sinner than he's a saint. And I think that Vasconcelos there, what he's doing is that he's betraying a certain historical consciousness, which is thinking of himself not just as an individual, but also somebody who is living in history and who will then, have to be interpreted by people who come after him in one way or another. And I think it's an impulse that is present in everybody who writes anything that is remotely autobiographical, which is you are setting down on paper a version of yourself, which is the way that you wish to be remembered. And I think that the importance of calling what I did fiction stems in part from the fact that I just have a great deal of respect for actual historians, and when I sent my old college professor, Lorena Adorno, who is the scholar of colonial Latin American literature, a copy of my novel, I said, Professor, please remember this is fiction, and that I know that a lot of things that I say about another Mexican intellectual, this one from the 1700s, Carlos Sigüenza y Góngora, I know that a lot of it is not true. but bear with me, And I think that the novelist maybe is just a historian who's a bit more honest and just admits that he is fabricating things, right? Good historians don't fabricate things, but the mere fact of looking at events through a certain lens already distorts them and already makes it impossible for us to access sort of like an unmediated truth about the past. And so hence why Cortés is an important character in the book too, not as a military leader, but as what I think he's primarily remembered today, as a writer. He wrote an account of the conquest of Mexico, which forms the basis for what most people think happened. That is completely just not true, but becomes history by the mere fact of him writing it, right? I think the novel, alongside its thinking through the historical moment that it was written in and one that immediately followed it, which to my great sorrow has proven a bit prophetic of what was to come. The novel is also a meditation on the impossibility of really telling the truth about anything that is happening in history, particularly the one that one experiences directly, right? If you're writing about something that is very distant, if you're writing about the 17th century, like my professor Adorno would do, your emotional investment in what is happening is perhaps not as intense. But for me, writing about the first Trump administration, while I watched my life project in the United States fall apart, it would have been dishonest of me to pretend that what I was writing was objective, and hence just say, here is a novel. It does not purport to represent reality. Make of it what you will. If you want the facts, here's a list of books that do it better than me.
That's fair. I love that. I'm glad that you've clarified that because I think that for your readers of your book, that will be important. So thank you. Here is something I think that you might laugh when I ask you this. There's something very Netflixy about the way each section has an overview of what will happen in that section. Like in Emily in Paris, you've got, you're clicking through Netflix and it has that little section and you know what's going to happen, but you still want to see it because you want to see the scenes and the beautiful, sexy people, right? So I thought that there was something that like that in your novels. So would you consider this a performative device that might lend your text to a film adaptation?
Well, I don't know if it would lend itself to an adaptation. I now write screenplays for a living, and I wouldn't even know how one would go about adapting this particular novel. Just because you would have to pick one of the strands and then leave everything else out. And I would worry, that the adaptation would necessarily, fail because I do think that you kind of need all the strands for it to work. But I will say that certainly the techniques of film montage and of TV editing obviously played a huge part in the way that this book is structured. Partially because, I watch TV and I think that you absorb what you watch, right? What you consume, regardless of whether you want it or not. And also because I think that film, and particularly, the French New Wave, which is just a weird Frenchman's idea of what Hollywood movies would be like if they were, more pretentious. The way that it handles narrative with jump cuts, with switching gears very brusquely, I find very attractive. But I guess there's another side to this structure, which is the little section headings that you describe. They're lifted from Don Quixote, right? Cervantes begins every single chapter by saying, "Chapter 57. In which it is told of the time that Don Quixote and Sancho got into a fist fight at a bar at a tavern," and so on and so forth, right? And so I guess the twin impulses of the structure are on the one hand, I don't know, Truffaut, and on the other hand, Cervantes, if you're generous. If you're less generous, it's Emily in Paris, which I actually kind of love because my cousin actually directed a couple of the episodes, and I think they're great, I don't think there's anything bad about being accessible. On the contrary, I worried that my novel would be boring, and so I tried to make it fun. Mm-hmm. And the people who know how to make things interesting more than anybody else today, it's screenwriters, and I think that there's a lot that people who write literature should learn from them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense, and I can see a little bit of this palimpsestic information that it comes through in your text, right? One last question, because I know I'm looking at the time, and you have lots of Spanish. You have el hijo pródigo. So what does that do for your American, for your English only reader, right? You have perder toda la esperanza. I have to say it in that Spanish because you feel
Hmm.
that's what you get, right? La revancha de los pedantes, So for me, I'm having a ball reading this, right? Para Rudiger Campe, el hijo pródigo, so I'm having a ball reading all of this because, it in a response to my lexical, formation, right? But what does that mean? Like you said, you want people to read it, you want people to understand it. Why would you do that without translation? And
Hmm.
without a little footnote or without something in the back? Like, can you explain? I keep again thinking about strategy, your strategies as a writer, right? So if you could talk a little bit about that, because you're talking about América del Norte, but you're really based in Spanish, So there's this, again, this kind of interplay between English, Spanish that you lo manejas, right? You really work that, and it comes across, it's clear in your text, but then how is it clear or not clear to your reader?
Yeah, well, so that's a great question. I think the intention is for the monolingual Anglophone reader to feel put off by the book. It's a hostile gesture in some ways. There's a point in the book where there's, I believe, 4 full pages of untranslated Spanish. And not only any Spanish, it's, my attempt at like ventriloquizing sort of like very rural central Mexican Spanish, which is, I think would be difficult to understand even for some people in Madrid, for instance. In fairness, though, it's not just the Anglophone reader that it gets, sort of like taken for a spin. There's a bunch of French in the novel. There's, I think, a total of 9 languages. There's Zapotec, there's Maya, and the very, very end is in Amharic, which is a language spoken in Ethiopia that has an entirely different writing system, such that, I mean, I hope that there were a couple of like Amharic speakers who got to the end of the novel and got like the world's best Easter egg ever, but most people won't, right? And I think part of the idea behind that is to, you know, the novel is called América del Norte because there used to be, until fairly recently, there was this notion among like the Mexican intelligentsia and the Mexican upper class that, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, now known as the USMCA, was going to bring Mexico and the United States together as friends. But that obviously did not happen, right? But but as a result, you know, wealthy Mexicans or the children of wealthy Mexicans or of elite Mexicans were expected to learn English and to speak English as well as they spoke Spanish, right? Maybe even to write in English as well as they wrote in Spanish. And I was very much one of these kids. Hence why, my first novel is not in my native language, but in my adopted language, right? And I guess that since this is a novel about the collapse of the idea of America del Norte, about the discovery, as the narrator puts it at one point, that America del Norte does not mean the same thing as North America. It's a novel that should also dramatize the fact that like the only subjectivity that could actually get all of the inside jokes is, one of like 10 people, right? Who were educated to inherit this new America that would replace what, your students probably know as like Jose Marti's Nuestra America, right? Instead of like our America, our Latin America that is, defined in opposition to the US, my generation of elite Mexicans was educated to inherit North America, this new polity, this that would eventually resemble the European Union, where people could move across the border without, anybody giving them any trouble, where everybody would, get wealthier, and where everybody would be, if not friends, then at least tolerant of one another. Of course, the opposite happened. And so now the narrator of this novel, is stuck speaking perfect English and perfect Spanish, and also unable to communicate the most important things to speakers of either language. And so the novel in its form tries to dramatize that. I think that, would I do it again now? Maybe not to the same extent. Now that translation into Spanish is in the works, my translator, this wonderful guy, Saruc Serrano, has a number of ideas of how to find an equivalent in Spanish, right? And I think we're going to go with this, something that Tolstoy does with his fancy Russians, which is he makes them speak French. Maybe all of the fancy Mexicans speak to one another in English, even if the novel is in Spanish. But we'll see.
Yeah. That's what I suspected would happen, right? Because then you're still playing or working within the two languages that are being used and pushed forward by your group, but also by many other people. I think that, US Latinos, for example, will read both of those languages easily.
Of course. I mean, that's the other thing, like there's a readership, I think, that can really get both ends of the narrative, and that's Latinx Americans, right? We didn't get into this in the parts that I read, but like there's an important character in the novel who has a complicated relationship with the narrator, who's a Chicana writer.
I bet. Yes,
yeah.
that was one of the questions. So go ahead.
But for instance, like the resonance. I'm not the first person to discover these resonances. Vasconcelos thought that Chicanos or Chicanx people were the ultimate Mexicans, right? He thought they were the best Mexicans. He thought they were the ones who were actually the cosmic race for him was, being born in the United States, from Mexican immigrants. And then partially, perhaps because of that reason, Gloria Saldúa, the great Latina and Chicana writer of Teoría Autohistoria, I believe is what she called her genre, cites Vasconcelos extensively in her masterpiece, Borderlands - La Frontera. And I don't know this for a fact, but I've always suspected that the battle cry of La Raza is La Raza Cósmica. Don't quote me on this. I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist. I make stuff up. But yeah, in a way, I think like the gestures of including all the Spanish, untranslated Spanish, was a way of kind of inviting or thanking, like Latinx readership. Because while I don't think that I was ever a member of that community, simply because of the circumstances in which I grew up, I have a great deal of affection for them. And so I wanted my book to give them like a preferential treatment, if you will.
And I read it. I think it was very readable. So
good.
Yeah. I'm looking at the clock and I think we're at the end, but I want to say thank you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And I hope that as other people see this, because this is, taped, after they read your book and they get to see this interview, they get a better idea of what's going on and what was behind the writing and the process and the genre that we end up having in our hands. So I'm going to say muchísimas gracias por América del Norte.
Al contrario, Lucia.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I think I'll
go
back to, I guess, the Ames Public Library. And I hope that you come visit us sometime.
I would love that.
Yes, that would be lovely if you could come visit sometime. Thank you both so much for your time this evening. That was a really wonderful and insightful discussion. Clelia and I laughed a lot while we were watching in the Rotary Room together. So yes, thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who has joined us for this conversation.